Okay, so just in case anybody hasn't heard this before, Veda Peters, 11th Annual Air Quality and Health Workshop. I'm here with Dr. Jules Bergeron from the University of Calgary. Bergerson, pardon me.
Bergerson, yeah.
Bergerson. I'll get it right yet. I had less trouble with Big Jerry. So, air pollution from fossil fuel and transportation. So what are the key air pollutants that have been associated with transporting fossil fuels?
Yeah, so they're primarily associated, I think most of the discussion these days on fossil fuel and transportation has been focused on greenhouse gas emissions. And when you actually look at transport and their contribution to air quality pollutants, a lot of those tend to be the ozone formation precursors. So NOx emissions and VOCs. And so that's where I focused a lot of my discussion in the presentation was on NOx emissions associated with transport.
What are the impact of those NOx emissions concentrations relative to other sources of air pollution?
Yeah, so in Canada, it's about 1 million tons of NOx emissions that come from transportation. And in Canada in total, it's about 2 million. So about 50% of the emissions actually come from transportation.
That's significant. Mm-hmm. And where do those emissions end up? What's their reach?
Right, so they can be transported, I would say that they're regional in the way that they're transported in terms of their fate. And so they're obviously going to have more of an effect in the urban centers than in the rural settings. It's specifically local in terms of their potential to have an effect. And so local, what I mean by local is the ambient concentration of other species that are in that area and the amount of emission that you're actually injecting into that area. And so there's a complex chemistry that's happening in the atmosphere, and so meteorology, wind patterns, all of these types of things are going to affect the fate and transport, as well as the actual formation of ozone itself, right? So the temperature, the concentrations of other species, all of these kinds of things. So it's a little bit complex in terms of saying specifically what impact a ton of NOx emissions have, because they're going to have a different effect in different locations.
Okay, so what approaches are we taking now to minimize those air quality impacts?
Right, so we have emission controls that are in place. We have, it's actually a broad suite of things that are being done that have an effect overall on the NOx emissions. So one thing is, though, that we're increasing our transportation and therefore increasing our transportation emissions. And as part of that, we're doing multiple things to try and reduce. So at stationary sources, we're trying to reduce emissions through control technology. So say a power plant would have NOx controls and things like that. Decreasing driving would be another example, right? So trying initiatives to try and get you to take other forms of transportation and things like that, that would ultimately have an effect in terms of reducing the NOx emissions.
Okay, but coal doesn't transport itself, so how do we get there? Are we just talking fossil fuels in general?
I was just talking in general, and actually a lot of what I emphasized in my talk was about taking a systems approach through the entire life cycle of each of these fuels, because we need to prioritize where we're going to spend our dollars in terms of making reductions. And I would argue that you have to do that through the entire supply chain, as well as through the entire energy system that we have in our economy. And so looking at a broad range of potential reduction opportunities.
Okay, so there are, obviously this is a changing technology. Yes? Are there knowledge gaps, and what are they?
Yeah, so in terms of the knowledge gaps, I sort of identified two different pieces. One was associated with the air quality itself, and so I think that we're still understanding air quality science associated with these emissions and what happens, the fate, the overall impacts, those kinds of things. So I still think that there's an issue there. One of the other issues is dealing with the uncertainty that's introduced when you have such a complex system that you're actually measuring. We have new methods of monitoring that we need to incorporate in a better way, and as those develop, we need to get them into the modeling as well as just the assessment itself. And then in terms of the systems approach, which I was arguing for, a lot of times we sort of look at things in isolation, and we need to do very local and detailed analysis. But at the same time, it would help to take a bigger picture approach to how we manage our emissions as a country, as a province, and as a city.
So it's not just a local issue.
Right.
It needs to be considered overall.
Yep.
Excellent. Well, I think you've answered my questions. Anything you want to add?
No, I think that's good.
Okay, then we're out. Thank you very much.
Thank you.